and what we're trying to do is move child welfare systems. And when I say child welfare systems, I'm not just talking about county or state-based systems. I'm talking about all of us who are involved in doing evaluations and providing services, the courts, everybody. So when you hear me say child welfare systems, I'm really talking about the entire system. And what we're trying to do is move from domestic violence destructive to domestic violence competent or proficient. And to give you a sense of the domestic violence destructive piece of things, domestic violence destructive child welfare practice looks like this. Expecting a domestic violence survivor to get a civil order of protection, a stay-away order. It's called different things in different jurisdictions, obviously. And expecting them to do that as an indication that they're trying to keep their kids safe. And a way to prevent an opening of a case, or maybe to prevent court action, and doing that without regard to whether the perpetrator's pattern indicates whether that's actually going to decrease or increase risk. That's why I want to start making the connection with the perpetrator pattern. Sometimes civil orders of protection actually help keep kids safe. Sometimes they don't. But to expect somebody to demonstrate their protective capacity to their kids by getting a civil order of protection without regard to the perpetrator's pattern is a domestic violence destructive child welfare practice.
That the data about the correlation and concerns about domestic violence perpetrators and kids is important. The issue is really actually how we operationalize it day to day. We can know the data, we can raise our awareness, but if we can't turn it into good practice, if we can't make it useful day to day in a meaningful way, then that data actually, in some ways, has created concern. Because part of it, to be honest, as the concern for domestic violence kids has risen, what we've seen is unintended consequences as systems have often practiced from a failure to protect perspective. And so as we've increased our ability to identify domestic violence as a child safety, child well-being concern, what we've done is turned our attention to the survivor of the domestic violence, the victim of the crime, the non-offending parent. I'm kind of giving you all this language so you can see which one hangs better for you and kind of helps you think it through. But in a sense, what we've done is said and put our focus on the victim's decision-making, the victim's choice-making, and now even in a sort of a slightly more insidious way, the victim's trauma history. And what we made the conversation about as we become legitimately concerned around domestic violence and its impact on kids is we've become to focus on the victim's choices.
And so really when you put this to practice, it changes the way you talk about it, the way you think about it, the way you talk to clients. So really imagine approaching a domestic violence survivor from this perspective and what it would look like. And it wouldn't look like, well, I'm here to talk to you about your relationship choices and you need to make better relationship choices. And it would mean you wouldn't roll your eyes when she says, well, I still love him and I want to be back with him. I asked a group of child welfare supervisors once what their reaction was when a worker comes back to them and says, well, she still loves him. And to a person, they said, oh my God, what are we going to have to do? What's it going to take? We're going to have to get more aggressive here. We're going to have to get, we're going to have to look at, because they associated her love for him as being a child safety concern. Now, there's probably many people in this room who would say they love a family member who's done some bad things to them. That doesn't mean you're not aware of what they did and you don't strategize about how to deal with it. And what we've done is really sort of make victims responsible and make them really the one to blame for perpetrators' behavior. We've institutionalized, and this is about changing that institutionalization around this thing. And so what you do is you change the way, if you really practice this way, you would be able to see it in your work because it would change the way you talk to victims. So instead of saying, we're here to talk to you about making better relationship choices, we're here because your partner chose to get violent and we're concerned for your safety and the safety of your kids. And when she says, well, he's my husband, we were married, we're from a small community, we've been together 20 years, we're an immigrant community, I don't want to leave my community, I don't want, and then you get to say, you know what? Your love for him, your desire to be part of your community, those aren't problems. Our concern is your safety and the safety of your kids from his behavior. If she says, well, I want to go back to him, then the conversation is, why do you think that's going to be safer or different than before? And how do you think he's changed? Because his history indicates that he hasn't changed. Because all we're concerned about is you and your child being safe. And just imagine how that's going to be received differently than, well, this is really about the poor choices. We've looked at your case file and really have a history of picking bad men.
And so part of that Safety of the Model Advocacy Institute is we train them to train the model into child welfare and also into their own agencies, because the truth is sometimes co-located advocates are often feeling isolated in their own agencies. And their own agencies often don't understand what the mission is, and there's a history of tension between DV advocates and child welfare. And so we talked about how to use the model to train into advocacy, their own agencies, and build relationships and capacity there. One of my favorite stories out of this was, I think it was here in Florida, where one of the advocates was training her colleagues around using a perpetrator pattern-based approach and saying that domestic violence perpetration is a parenting choice. And then what she came back and told us was that she taught this to her colleagues, and one of the colleagues was running a group for domestic violence involved, child welfare involved domestic violence survivors. And what I recollect, and maybe Heidi and Bridget have an additional piece of this, was that the first group, and the facilitators asking the women to talk about why they're there. You go around, you can imagine the guilt, the shame, anger, why am I here? Just a lot of negative emotion, a lot of heaviness. And then the facilitator says, we're going to go around again and we're going to check in one more time. But this time the question I want you to answer is, tell me about your partner's parenting. And I want you to hear, and again, connect this, and I couldn't believe without doing this one more time, that just by asking the question, you're doing something like this. Does that make sense? Because otherwise he's invisible. And I think like today, in Kathy and Casey's story, Roger was an invisible presence. He wasn't on the stage, but everything they talked about related to his choices, his behavior, those dilemmas, the parentification, the way Casey didn't know whether to come in the room or not, Kathy's challenges, all that was created by Roger's violence, and they were all on some level parenting choices, and they're all the ways he was being a bad parent. And so by just asking that question in that group and saying to these women, tell me about your partner's parenting choices, their partners were brought into the room, and their responsibility came with it in some level, in the sense that they had some role, because the facilitator was asking the question. Imagine if all that in the group was about, Mom, what do you do? What could you do? How can we support you? All great questions. But if you didn't ask that question about, tell me about his parenting. So CPIs and investigators and assessment workers can think about this. When you ask mothers, even if you don't meet the perpetrator, tell me about your partner's parenting, you're doing something like this. You're equaling it out. You're kind of changing the paradigm a little bit.
And so to push it even a little further is, even if the domestic violence survivor is a trauma survivor, and she grew up with violence, and she's been in 2, 3, 4, 5 violent relationships, our practice would reflect that in each of those relationships, each of those perpetrators made their own choice to get violent. The violence and the danger that violence represented to the kids was not coming from mom's trauma history, was coming from that perpetrator's choice of violence. And so what I want to say to you is, how often have you been in rooms and situations where it will come up and somebody will say, well, she's been in multiple domestic violence relationships. Now I want to compare that to how many times you've heard people say, well, he's abused a number of women and kids. And does that really stack up in your memory about how often that comes up? He's a serial abuser. We really have to bring this to a multidisciplinary team, because this is a really hard one, because he's abused 3 or 4 different of our clients and their kids. And we really need to bring the team together to really look at how we're going to address his behavior. Because he's a threat to these families and he's a threat to our community.